Hey y'all, it's me, the Nosy Goddess, and today we're getting into the business of Joe Francis and his franchise, Girls Gone Wild, and it's the Untold story, okay? Now, this documentary is a Peacock original, and it's a three-parter. I have notes, I have pictures, and I'm going to walk you through it because it was something else, okay? So, part one begins by showing Joe's sprawling estate in Putamita, Mexico. Okay. And this is where he's been for the past 10 years. He's not the same Joe Francis as he once was. Now, if you remember, Joe Francis introduced us to the Girls Gone Wild franchise. I know you guys remember Girls Gone Wild. If you were around in the early 2000s, of course, you would see these videos popping up in late night commercials. And typically, you would see young Caucasian girls flashing and being wild. And he made millions of dollars off of this franchise. So, part one begins by showing Joe's sprawling beachfront estate. He brags on the fact that it is 45,000 square feet. And we see a pool, jacuzzi, tennis court, and beautiful landscaping. So the reporter, Sachi, cool, she did an investigation on Girls Gone Wild and Joe Francis in 2022. She began this investigative report for BuzzFeed. And that's how it all began, actually. So it was 2022. Sachi flew into Mexico to interview Joe. Joe grills Sachi about how she's, not going to do a hit piece on him, and says he doesn't allow video, but he's okay with being tape recorded. Now, he's very demanding, and they point this out in the very beginning of the documentary. He's heard yelling at staff and asking for things to be done. We're really demanding for things to be done right now. Very cold, very dictator-like. And this is at the very beginning of the documentary and giving us just a very small glance of what we're going to find out later on about Joe Francis. Now, Sachi assures him that all she's going to do is tell the truth. She's a professional. She doesn't do hit pieces. Now, she lets us know that this documentary, or even this article, was 4 years in the making, and he spoke for a total of 9 hours. Now, they go into the Girls Gone Wild phenomenon by showing celebrity faces, and blurred out photos of very young Caucasian girls featured on the videos. Mostly advertised on late night TV, the words cultural phenomenon are said multiple times. They flashed through tons of footage showing how popular the brand had become. And Joe Francis himself is now a celebrity. From celebrities, comedians, talk show hosts, and even politicians referenced or spoke about Girls Gone Wild. Women who were there during the phenomenon speak out about their experiences, saying it was all smoke and mirrors. They spoke of being obviously drunk and being manipulated by empty words and promises, also speaking on cameramen blocking exits of the bus or the room and being threatened if they didn't comply. Staff were being instructed not to give up and do whatever it takes to be persistent. Joe was quoted saying, "If I were to take no for an answer, I wouldn't be where I was." He is referenced as a miserable little shit by one of his ex staff members. They show video footage from his house camera of him chasing a female staff member around the jacuzzi as she screams and runs out of sight of the camera. Looks like she's also trying to record with her phone. He chased her down aggressively until they were off camera. Now, who knows what happened after they were off camera? Now, it turns out we find out later that he has hundreds of charges, pending charges against him since he's been in Mexico. Now, he challenged the reporter Sachi to effing nail him when they were starting off the interview. Now, a contributor talks about how in the late 90s, it's late night. You could be watching late night TV like Howard Stern, I Love Lucy, South Park, and suddenly a commercial pops up saying it's not suitable for children. And what child is going to turn the channel and turn off the TV? Who's going to say, I got to go, I can't watch this? And this was sarcasm from the person that was speaking. Typically, anyone underage is just going to really want to actually watch more than they would have wanted to if that sign hadn't have popped up. A lady says you couldn't turn away because you didn't know what you were going to see. They described the commercials as a strange, sexy world where there are only girls who want to show you their boobs. And it's described as shocking. Sachi, the reporter, says she was investigating initially for a BuzzFeed article. The brand was long dead, and people questioned why she had any interest in doing such an expose. It had been such a long time ago. That's what people would tell her. She says because Joe Francis and Girls Gone Wild is the precursor to much of what we see today. OnlyFans, girls getting famous on Instagram, social media micro-influencers. She gives Joe credit for helping to create that. She was nervous and fearful when she went to his house with security. Now, Joe, he says he did it all by himself and that it was incredibly hard work. He describes his childhood as harsh. He says he was a paper boy at 7 years old, that he was working hard, and his dad had a lot of financial problems. He said he had gotten a special work permit so he could scoop ice cream. And he said he lived in the living room of his parents' small little house and that he was supporting his family. He said he went from 14 years old to buying his first private jet about 13 years later. Now, this seemed to be a rags to riches story that Sachi could not confirm. She said his dad worked in direct marketing and that he was actually raised in Laguna Beach, California, which is affluent and comfortable. Now, Joe did go to USC in the mid-90s and he graduated with a business degree. Out of college, he worked as a production assistant for a show called Real TV. There was a lot of too inappropriate, too violent, or too sexy content that was left on the cutting room floor. Things that were kind of in the vein of America's Funniest Home Videos, Cops, HBO's Real Sex, gritty, grisly, and grimy. Now, Joe compiled and put these footage in home videos, called it Banned for Television. You could call and order the tapes. Then one day he came across a tape of young women at New Orleans Mardi Gras. Women lifting their tops for beads, and it turned him on. He scoured all the video stores and found nothing like it. This was during an era when women were breaking out from the confines of tradition and being controlled by their parents. Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Paris Hilton, etc. So from there, he started Mantra Films, but was unable to buy ad space. So he used Howard Stern's show as a TV distributor, and that's where he was able to show his ads. And wouldn't you know, the ads went viral across a lot of different channels. Comedy Central, Fox Sports, and the rest is history. Girls Gone Wild was born. Girls Gone Wild made $20 million within the first 2 years. So basically, Joe recorded and photographed drunk girls on spring break showing their boobs. Real girls, clean cut, sweet, approachable, girls next door. These are girls that wouldn't normally do something like this, but that would do it for you. This is how they marketed their Girls Gone Wild videos. Average American, nice girl who really wanted to be naughty. Joe capitalized off of what they call slut culture, where girls felt like they were being fun and free, usually girl next door types, clueless to the downside and the repercussions of being on such a video. Some were underage. They had no idea of the downfalls. One lady talks about her experience in 1999. She was 16 on the beach in Lake Havasu and got approached by a guy with a camera to flash for a set of beads. She said the more you had meant you were popular. And she had a lot of Zimas, which I think is like a beer, in her system. She did a quick flash out of sight of anyone else, and she thought no one would ever know. She said a few months later, she was walking down the hallways at school, and people were making gestures of like flashing at her, and that confused her. She started hearing rumors about a Girls Gone Wild tape. She denied being on it when she was asked. She just played dumb. A teacher asked her to autograph his copy, and that teacher should have been arrested. But she was mortified. A friend of hers had a tape and she borrowed it. And she watched it alone at home and saw herself. She was completely flabbergasted. She eventually stopped going to school, which was the case for a lot of the girls. She later said she got a lawyer who explained to her that it was kiddie porn and that he could help her. He had her removed from the tapes and the commercials and all of that, and she got a small settlement. I guarantee you there was a lot more money to it, but the lawyer got his cut. Joe Francis credits himself for creating reality TV, the precursor to OnlyFans, Instagram influencers, etc. But he was a millionaire by the time he was 24 years old. Now, at some point, he did get convicted for an assault case and sentenced to 270 days to county jail, but he ended up fleeing the country, and he's been a fugitive for 10 years now. But the life he's living is a nice one, even though he's kind of living in his own personal luxury hell. And we'll get into more of that. Now, he is on social media, but he had taken a 2-year hiatus before coming back in September of 2024. And I find that to be interesting because that's the very same month that Diddy got arrested. And I haven't explored yet whether or not there is a connection between Diddy and Joe Francis, because Joe Francis's franchise very possibly could be linked to ass trafficking. So now we're going to move on to part 2. And we're talking April 2nd, 2003. There was a raid in Panama City, Florida. They discuss him feeling sick. Then he goes on to describe him being chased down by a police officer. Joe and his crew were descended upon by 43 police officers due to complaints by parents of minors. Joe said the whole jail was full of all of them. He said that they wanted to destroy him. One of the photographers details March 31st, 2003 in Panama Beach City, Florida, 2 days before the arrest. He and a couple of other cameramen were in the van driving slow and saw a group of girls on the side of the road. 2 of the cameramen got out to shoot the girls with their cameras, of course. He sees them flashing, and then he asks if they want to do a scene. They were across the street from the motel they were staying at. When they entered the room, 2 girls went into the bathroom, into the shower, and they shot a scene of them in the shower. 2 other girls were hanging out while they were shooting the scene. One was lingering in the hallway. Joe walked in and said, "Come here, girls," aggressively. He grabbed them by the arms and pulled them into a back room where the bedroom was. And then the door shut. He finished shooting the scene, the cameraman did, and he said the girls were happy go lucky, just like the spring breakers. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He walked away and that was it. He never thought anything about it. Not until everything hit the fan. Lee Sullivan, former mayor of Panama Beach City, spoke about how three ladies came to his door to speak to him. He had an open door policy. He told them to have a seat. He said they sat down and were distraught. They said their daughters had been filmed by the Girls Gone Wild down on Front Beach Road. Their daughters had regrets after the fact. And they were like, oh no, what have we done? And why did he let it happen? In early April, investigators stated interviewing the girls about what they were alleging. 3 of the girls were 17, one was 16, and she turned 17 the next day. The former sheriff of Bay County, Florida, Guy Tunnell, said his mind was blown about what Joe and his crew convinced the girls to do. Joe offered them money, and they said they were under the influence. And he felt it was Joe's intention to get them to feel loose and free. He thought it was disgusting and was ready to put them under the jail. They described how they were coerced to do sexual acts with each other, and then the guys, touching their private parts. The investigators realized they got them to do sex work, and they were each paid $50 for it. One cameraman said he didn't realize he did anything wrong until he was arrested for it. He said he was pissed because he asked the girls so many times if they were 18. He later realized that they were young and dumb and just wanted to be on, and he couldn't be mad at them. Law enforcement raided the hotel rooms and seized 175 hours of raw footage. Joe and his crew members were arrested. Panama City law enforcement went through the tapes methodically, one by one. They then had to track down the girls to find out how old they were when they filmed the scenes. They were able to identify 30 additional minors. It made the news. They were charged with so many charges: child prostitution, child pornography. The cameraman speaking said he didn't want to repeat them all. He said he didn't mind the Rico one, but the others were so nasty and horrendous that he didn't really want to deal with them or to think about them. Joe and Mark Schmitz, one of the cameramen, posted $50,000 bail and were released. Schmitz went home to his family as the prosecutors built their case. He said Joe called him, which he never did. He said he didn't call to ask how he was, but specifically where he was staying. He wanted the address. He was suspicious and hung up on him, and he said that he never called before or cared 2 shits about him. He was young and had 2 kids. He never talked to Joe again after that. He was facing life in prison, and it was extremely hard to swallow. He said his health went to total crap almost instantly. He started having weird shakes and twitches. He started blurting out stuff like 300 times a day, like Tourette's syndrome. He said he tried to forget about it and just live day by day with his kids. And this is him when he was young, when it was all going down. So it was built as a racketeering case, an intersection of crimes, kingpin stuff. The former sheriff said they are sometimes abused, the Ricos, but because Joe was such a prick that they loaded up on him. Joe had a lot at stake, but he didn't back down. He doubled down. He said he released the seized videos and marketed one of the tapes as seized footage, marketed as forbidden footage the cops don't want you to see. And it sold like crazy. He decided that the small-time hacks that tried to censor him would be taught a lesson. He insisted that he was innocent and that they didn't have anything on him. The case worked its way through the system for 5 years. He returned to Los Angeles a free man for the time being. He went back to Bel Air, convinced the cops down in Panama City were stupid. The former sheriff admitted that he wasn't worldly, and he called himself homespun. He said it had been a long time since he'd been to Los Angeles. He said Joe Francis could attract media better than he could, and that all those rich and famous people were important and made him important. He said Joe was the great hoorah while he was just the mayor of Whoville. Turns out the arrest is what catapulted him into stardom. He was referred to as a ladies' man by the news reporters. Joe Francis got rich and famous, and Girls Gone Wild begins to be fused with what was happening in Los Angeles and Hollywood. He had proximity to a lot of famous people. They detailed his dating life. Lindsay Lohan, Britney Spears, Kourtney Kardashian, Tara Reid. He went on talk shows like Tyra Banks. I find it interesting that he's pictured here with Danny Masterson and Ashton Kutcher. And if you're not aware, Danny Masterson is now spending many years in prison for sexual assault and rape. Now, even though Joe was doing semi-porn, he was winning. Proof that in Hollywood, they don't care what your work is. They care about what you can provide, the association, the money you have, the perks. Who's going to turn down getting treated at the best restaurants, flying on private planes? Joe's Girls Gone Wild branding was seen on famous people all the time, which was seen by millions of people. According to Saatchi, the gossip blogs were beginning to come in and usurp traditional media, and they were putting the pictures everywhere. It was framed as all in good spirit, all in good fun. There was a ton of mainstream success, which led to a lot of parodies, like SNL and Mad TV. It was everywhere. The laughter took away the danger of it. The comedy around it was a distraction. It softened the jagged edges around the real seediness of it. It wasn't seen for what it really was anymore. Joe was everywhere on MTV. He was, again, around all the celebrities. I mean, he was really the man about town in Hollywood. While the Panama City Beach case was going through the courts, Joe's company went through incredible growth. There was new staff. They talked to a runner, a company lawyer, and a former production supervisor, Scotchy, I think it's how her name is pronounced. Now, she was encouraged to stick with Joe by her father, who she says was himself a big deal in the industry. She didn't give us his name. She said her father told her Joe's business model was genius and being cited everywhere. She said when she met Joe that he was energized and he was excited she was there and made her feel inspired. Now, the lawyer that was there said that he was there to clean up the company. Title 18 compliance was non-negotiable. They verified IDs on camera and got signed releases now. The case triggered what became an avalanche of legal cases for the company. Joe said he spent $200 to $300 million on settlements and legal fees after the Panama Beach City case. Employees were encouraged to be aggressive and relentless when persuading the girls to perform XXX acts. Joe wanted to get it out there legally to help him win the case that was still pending. They got the shy girls to participate by coaching and luring and using tricky tactics. They would produce these scenes, and there were training sessions, and the audio from those sessions was played, and it was disgusting. They talked about how to get the girls to strip and have sex with each other. They get paid like $100. They were so young and naive, they thought it was great. They could spend another day in spring break with that. They had no idea about the consequences that would come later. They talked to 3 or 4 women from places like Kansas, West Virginia, and Michigan who were filmed when they were teens, back in like 2006 to 2007. They talked about how their low self-esteem and how they were lured in by Girls Gone Wild. They were 18 and went to the amateur cage and took their tops off until their time was up. Afterwards, they were approached by Girls Gone Wild crew to get on their bus. They gave their IDs and signed the paper. And they just signed it without even reading it. They didn't care what was on it. They just signed it. And once they did sign it, it got more sexual. Let's take your shirts off now. They were taken into the back bedroom of the bus where the door was shut. The cameraman placed himself by the exit door. Can you come interview with us and get comfortable? Next thing you know, they ended up nude. They were encouraged to kiss each other. They were asked to do jumping jacks at one point. There were bright lights, and they were so drunk their speech was slurred. They ended up doing sexual acts per the crew's instructions. They did it, but they didn't really want to. They were getting coached. You look hot. Keep doing it. They said it felt like an eternity on the bus. One lady said her older brother was trying to get her off the bus, but they locked the door and turned the music up so loud she couldn't hear her brother screaming. He confronted a couple of them once she came out and was saying, that's my little sister. You guys are sick. They saw two other girls who were coming onto the bus after them, and they questioned each other whether or not they should save them, but they decided to bail. The more shy and nervous the girl would be, the better. The production training audio detailed how they got the girls to go all the way. Joe said, it's all about how you say it. It was psychological. They played mind games with these girls. They were young and naive. And they really didn't care or even realize how it would affect them later on in life. The Girls Gone Wild bus was anticipated in many cities. Girls would be encouraged to perform certain acts in exchange for alcohol. Many of them were underage. In 2005, one cameraman detailed how FBI agents had gotten on the elevator with him. He immediately knew they were there for Mantra films. They got them all in the conference room, and they had already destroyed all the tapes with any underage girls and ones without the signed consents and no proof of ID. The agents conducting the raid told Joe, who was confident, and the agents were saying they didn't want to be there, and no one thought it was right. Because you got to realize by this time, Joe was a pretty big deal. He was very famous at this time, and men pretty much admired this guy. I mean, he was living a life that most of them dreamed about. So, they just felt like he wasn't doing anything wrong. These girls were doing what they wanted to do. It seemed innocent enough the way that it was portrayed on TV with ads running late at night. And the proximity to Hollywood and celebrities, again, made people feel like it wasn't that big of a deal. A special task force was put together on obscenity, and Girls Gone Wild was their first case. And that's why they were there at that particular time, to raid the offices to try to find any evidence for this new task force. In September 2006, Girls Gone Wild, the company, and Joe Francis pleaded guilty to 3 counts of producing visual depictions of sexually explicit conduct without keeping records on each performer. The judge imposed a $2.1 million fine and ordered Joe to perform 200 hours of community service. Joe sent one of his crew members to Florida in a private plane. He was excited until he found out he got there and he was sent to do Joe's community service. It was entitlement at its finest. One of his staff described him as a pompous ass and said that Joe was out of control. They described Joe being in the office as one person, a professional, and then on the road, he was a frat boy, where he was like a Jekyll and Hyde. They talked about how they hated when Joe came out on the road with them. He was like a maniac. Get her, get her, get her, get her. Like every blonde, pretty young girl he saw, he was telling them to go get her. They said he had no boundaries when it came to girls. They called him Hurricane Joe when they went on the road. And the crew, again, they hated when he would go with them. Now, there was one girl on the back of the bus who Joe pushed too far. She screamed and ran off of the bus. The police asked who did it when they came back with her, and Joe pointed at the guy next to him. Crazy. Now, a supervisor at one of the media outlets talked about a girl named Claire who worked for her. She was a 28-year-old reporter, and Claire wanted to do a story on Joe. And she said she knew Joe. She questioned why. And she thought he was a fascinating character. He had invited Claire to his home to stay there and do a story. And the superior who said she knew Joe said absolutely not. Claire didn't want to be interviewed on camera for this documentary. But she said that Joe invited Claire to join him on a trip for a new Girls Gone Wild series. They told Claire that she would work together with the crew as a team and that they would be flying private. So the superior gave in and gave her the green light, and she left for the trip. Well, the next morning, her superior got a call, and she said she had a bad feeling when she saw it was her calling, and rightfully so. Claire told her she had a really bad night. She said she was reporting all night, interviewing the girls. Later, Joe attacked her and tried to take her notebook. She was bruised and battered. She got away but was surrounded by various staff. Joe came back and asked her for a kiss. Her superior says she was worried about getting fired, and that made her angry. She told her she wanted to write about it, and her boss encouraged her. She told her to write everything down, so she wrote it herself an email. She met with a girl named Janelle who alleged that she was with Joe the night that he assaulted Claire. Janelle said that she was a virgin, which was a part of her appeal. She was coached to take her clothes off. She said after the crew left, Joe came on and he raped her. He was said to have exited the bus and said to someone out in the hallway of the bus that she's not a virgin anymore. Now, Janelle filed a police report but decided not to press charges. Claire tried to get a comment from Joe on the phone, and then he screamed at her and called her names. Then the lawyer sent her an email saying it was consensual and it only hurt because Joe was reputedly well endowed. She wrote the piece anyway, and everyone read it. The piece was published as the Panama City case was coming to trial. They seemed to have a strong case. He was facing decades in prison, but he seemed to be the luckiest man in America. The criminal case got thrown out because the investigators botched the case. Instead of treating it as a child porn case, they treated it like a complicated RICO case. They did so to try to get warrants for their motel rooms, but they didn't have a probable cause. They needed 2 probable examples, but they only had 1. The police were so determined that they lied to get the warrant, so everything was thrown out, even the tapes. The cameraman that spoke of his twitches said that once the case was dropped, that all of his twitches went away in an instant. Joe pleaded no contest to 1 count of felony child abuse and 2 counts of misdemeanor prostitution. He pleaded that to avoid being convicted of a sexual crime. He's not a registered sex offender. If he would have been charged with a sexual crime, he would have easily gotten 30 years in prison. Joe did a press conference saying there were no personal ramifications whatsoever, and then introduced the first ever Girls Gone Wild magazine. Saatchi talked about how Joe was untouchable. Joe refused to go on camera for this documentary. Girls Gone Wild have become an unforgettable brand. Men were excited when the bus would come to town. They have their own pilot for the private plane. And he talked about how fun it was, but how busy it was also. It seemed that Joe was unstoppable at this point. So now we're moving on to part 3, which is the part of the documentary. Joe talked about how Girls Gone Wild had really loosened everything up and made things much more fun for society, for life. He credited for the likes of the Kardashians. Now, for the girls who flashed, they had lifelong ramifications. They were approached by strangers asking them to sign DVDs like they were celebrities. They were taken advantage of and used. They made his livelihood and didn't get anything out of it but misery. They were confused about why the operation was never shut down. The miners were completely lost in the story because of the Panama City case being botched and tossed. This made people even more angry, so they went after him civilly. Joe and his lawyer went to mediation. His lawyer told him, just sit there, and at the end, when they make their demand, just say no and walk out. I think this gave Joe a false confidence. Joe went into mediation, sat back, and put his feet up on the table and told them he wasn't paying anything and for them to suck his dick. The judge put him in contempt, and he went to jail without bail. He offered the bailiff $100 to get him a bottle of water at one point. He still had his wallet. He wanted out bad. He compared himself to Jesus because he was shackled. He ordered food, spent hours on the phone. He called into the Kardashian show from jail. They showed the footage of Kim answering the phone when he called. She even wore a Free Joe t-shirt. The company was so well oiled that his absence didn't matter. The attention made things even better, actually. They ended up hiring a compliance officer to make sure that the IDs were documented. If a girl was regretful, they say the girl just had to call. But there was no number posted. It wasn't easy to do, especially if the girl was pretty. But when the compliance guy came across someone he knew, daughter, he confessed to removing her because she told him it would embarrass her dad. He actually shed tears when he was talking about it. March 13, 2008, after settling his civil case, Joe spent nearly a year in jail in Reno and was released. He went on a bunch of talk shows. He compared himself to Nelson Mandela on the Tyra Banks show. He said he wasn't paying anything, standing up for what was right. He often compared himself to martyred figures and consistently claims to be the victim. They interviewed his company's controller. She said she was blown away by his extravagant lifestyle and sensed that he was afraid of losing it. When he got out of jail, things were different. The internet was changing. Porn was more readily available. So Joe had to pivot. He sold more merch and created a hot girl reality show. That's where he met Abby Wilson. She was a model and the perfect Girls Gone Wild type. She was blonde, tiny, and beautiful. She came from Oklahoma. She met Joe Francis and started a life with him immediately. She was a good look for him. It was called reputational laundering. So then they started to talk about guys gone wild. They described them as hot, young, innocent boys, marketed to gay guys for the most part. Gay guys like straight guys, the most forbidden fruit, they said. The female producer shown here and her female crew had to pressure and coax the guys to orgasm. It was verbal porn and uncomfortable. She finally felt the loathing of it. So she was fine when she was doing it and helping them do it with the girls, or watching more so while the guys coaxed the girls. But now that she had to work with guys, it was like she was also doing the porn herself. She had to talk to them dirty and coach them about how to touch, their private parts and what to do. So now she was disgusted and she wanted a promotion. She felt like she deserved it, but she was denied. She was disappointed after having defended Joe on talk shows and other public spaces. She said he was only loyal to himself, and she finally realized that. So now Joe and his niche had started to peak. His behavior declined. He was voted douchebag of the year by a popular blog called Gawker Magazine, which I remember actually. He screamed and ranted for his lawyer to get it removed, but he couldn't. He was cutting financial corners, partying way more. He almost missed a payroll deadline once. The controller that he hired sent a staff member to his home because she didn't want to miss payroll. And then when he answered the door and found out that she sent this person, he called her and screamed at her in front of others, and she ended up quitting. He was an asshole, and people were quitting left and right. He fired his compliance manager because he couldn't do strict lawyer work. The compliance guy searched Mantra Films and found some violent footage from a West Hollywood bar. This lawyer named Ronald Richards came on camera, and he talked about having to chase Joe down for 16 years, multiple jurisdictions, multiple counties. He was contacted in 2009 by Jade Nicole, who was a former Playboy model. She bumped into Joe in a nightclub and poured a drink on him, and he turned around and battered her. TMZ was outside of the club, and they interviewed Jade Nicole. They showed the footage of that, and she was hysterical. She showed them her bruises and cried about the incident. It turns out she poured the drink on him intentionally in defense of her friend Abby Wilson, who he was dating at the time. Abby had told her friend Jade Nicole that he was cheating on her. He kissed a girl right in front of her and then tried to kiss her afterward, and she was humiliated. And then after that, he was harassing her. As far as their relationship went, they said they were on and off all the time. She was only 18 when they met, and he was in his late 30s. He was older, tall, and handsome, which was a dream for a young girl. It wasn't the first accusation of violence, though. There were tons of allegations on file. Even his own mother filed a restraining order against him. She said he tried to throw her down the stairs because she was trying to defend her husband, who he shoved, and that was his father. Joe wrote her a letter and asked her if she was dead yet and called her a cunt. But he denied all of it. He has a clear disdain and contempt for women. This is from one of his staff members. The company was still operating despite all of the lawsuits, and even more lawsuits began to ensue. In 2011, Panama Beach City, Florida, the Bible Belt, caused more problems for Joe. 4 anonymous women filed suit for intentional infliction of emotional stress, child abuse, coercion into prostitution, and sexual exploitation and battery. A clinical psychiatrist who was an expert for the trial interviewed the ladies. The girls were aged between 13 and 16 years old at the time, accusing him of sexual assault, child abuse, and prostitution. Some of the girls ended up dropping out of college, struggling with drugs, and becoming homeless. They hoped for justice and to be a warning for other girls, and for Joe to be found liable. So this threatened to derail Girls Gone Wild. In 2011, his lawyer told him his father died and he had to go bury him, so he lost his attorney right before the trial started. He decided to represent himself instead of getting a new attorney. There was a reporter who decided to write a book on his own, and he went to that trial every day. He and Joe must have gotten a little buddy because Joe had at some point asked him to help him find an attorney. But before then, Joe ended up with an all-female jury. I guess he thought it would be to his advantage. Joe said he did an Adderall all night, and he read a whole book on procedure before the trial started. He went into court the next day and cross-examined every effing witness, according to him. He intimidated those young girls, being a big man and being able to ask whatever he wanted in an attempt to defend himself. From the transcript, from the testimony of one of the girls' mothers, one of the plaintiffs called her father on the phone to tell him she'd been raped for Girls Gone Wild, and he died of a heart attack right on the phone while talking to her. After he died, the daughter went to the funeral and cried, "I'm sorry," over his casket. She had psychological issues after that. She became an alcoholic. She was paranoid that people were following her and trying to kill her. Her mother said she'd never be the same. Joe stood to lose millions and his entire empire. Now, the reporter who was there writing his book, he said he couldn't get out of his own way. He said the judge told him that he was digging his own grave and that he was considering contempt. Joe asked that reporter who was writing that book if he knew a lawyer. He his stepdaughter. When Joe introduced Miss Seaton Verga as his new lawyer to the court, he was still trying to be his own lawyer until the new lawyer, Miss Seaton Verga, turned to him, pointed to him, and told him to sit there and shut the F up. And this is the type of woman that he wasn't used to, but somebody that he needed in order to help him beat this case. She told the jurors in her closing argument to imagine having a daughter who was flashing, spring breaking, underage smoking and drinking, and now imagine making her a millionaire for it. She said to them, that's certainly a lesson in personal responsibility. The jury decided not to award the women any money. Joe felt vindicated. He was found guilty of outrageous conduct. The girls were said to not be damaged or deserve financial compensation. The decision was devastating and meaningless for the women who sued. Actually, they lost. The all-women jury probably worked against them, according to that reporter who was there writing his book. He said they should have had dads who wanted to protect their daughters, not judgmental moms. They showed a clip of Dr. Phil saying that one girl who was on his show was big stupid. Oprah said they were dumb for not getting paid. Newsweek called it the Girls Gone Wild effect when they referred to Lindsay Lohan, Britney Spears, Paris Hilton, and their influence on America's youth. The man behind the camera, they weren't examined or judged. So following all of this, Joe had a big feud with Steve Wynn, who owns the Wynn Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Joe owed him money and Steve filed suit. Joe filed sworn affidavits saying Steve was filing false accountings and charging his big whale gamblers money that they didn't lose. He challenged Steve Wynn's business model. Steve sued and won for $40 million for slander. And Joe had to file a Chapter 11 crumbling his empire. $16 million in debt, $10 million owed to Steve Wynn. He woke up and he had nothing. So after all of that he went through with all of those other lawsuits civilly with these girls or women who were girls at the time that they felt they were taken advantage of, it took for a casino and hotel owner in Las Vegas to be the one to actually crush his empire. And it all had to do with his ego. In January 2011, Joe went to a Hollywood club and was said to have forced 3 women to his home, where he violently grabbed a woman by her hair and throat and slammed one woman's head to the floor. He was arrested and charged. He went to trial and lost, and he was sentenced to 270 days in county jail for misdemeanor assault. He was out on bond while the case was pending on appeal, and that's when he decided to flee to Mexico with his then girlfriend, Abby. Because he left the country, he now faced 3 to 4 years in custody. So they stayed in Mexico. They had 2 daughters, lived in a sprawling beachside property with private chefs and maids, but his abuse became unbearable. They played audio of Joe and Abby in a vicious fight, displayed his abuse and her terrifying fear of him. Abby ended up leaving Mexico and returning to Oklahoma with their daughters. She said Joe raped her and physically assaulted her, and that he kept her from leaving sooner. Joe denied it. He told Sachi, the reporter, "You can't rape your partner." But she said, "Yes, you can. You absolutely can." And then he lost it. "Oh, you can? Oh, okay. I'll deny raping Abby Wilson or my daughters too. I'll say, if anything, that she raped me." Now, when he said, "or my daughters too," that was actually very chilling. No one brought up him harming his daughters. But when he said that, I kind of wondered if he actually did. So the BuzzFeed story was published. He sent an email to Sachi's coworker saying that she was a lying retard. Said that she lied to him and slandered him despite his warnings. Called her piece a hot trash article and says she was too ugly and disgusting to ever be on Girls Gone Wild. He called her a lying cunt. People didn't take her seriously when she said she feared him. They were like, Joe Francis, the guy from like 2006? but she knew what he was capable of. He projects this image of peace and tranquility in Mexico, but the BuzzFeed reporter found more than 30 cases involving him in Mexico. There were grievances, civil cases, business disputes with individuals and government agencies and other companies. Now, they showed this video footage in a 2023 altercation between him and a housekeeper at his estate. And it looks like she's trying to record him while terrified as he comes for her, even jumping through the hot tub to get her. She screamed for help at the top of her lungs while running away from him. They also showed Joe in a hospital room in March 2024. Allegations were that he had been beaten up. He denied it, of course. He was asked if he missed LA or the scene. He said no, but he missed his kids. He said, I don't miss LA, but I miss my kids. I miss them every day, and I cry about them every day. And that's the only thing in the world that I miss, he said. He was asked if having daughters has changed his view of Girls Gone Wild. He said no. It reaffirms that girls make their own decisions and are responsible for their own decisions. One of his victims was asked if she could say anything to Joe, what would she say? And she said, don't be a coward and take accountability. This is something that I will definitely have to explain for the rest of my life. Even after his bankruptcy, the women's images are still out there. One wonders if any of the crew look back and feel any guilt. One of the crew members says he was sorry. He says he feels like he'll probably go to hell. He says he won't have enough time in his life to pay back the karma. He said he found out about a girl who tried to take her life, and that really effed him up. He cried while he was saying that. Girls Gone Wild feels outdated, but culturally, we're still there when it comes to the objectification and abuse of women's bodies. The fact that Joe is irrelevant is the best thing for everybody. And this is coming from Sachi, the reporter. Joe declined on camera to follow up with a statement. They then let us know that the Girls Gone Wild archive was purchased by an online porn company, which means that all the girls who were featured are now online porn actresses against their will. The footage still remains online to this day. It's really sad to learn, that these girls as young as 13 years old were manipulated, coerced, coached, and plied with liquor on top of everything to loosen them up and make them feel free and that they were also safe when they really weren't. Some of them sexually assaulted, most of them just really regretful, and a lot of them just ended up ruining their lives because of these fleeting moments. And Joe himself ended up becoming a rich man, living this celebrity lifestyle, having the time of his life, flying around the world in his private plane. But while he was doing all that, he was hurting a lot of people. And it's just really a shame that, he could have really done good things with the money that he made. Even if he did these horrible things, he could have at some point taken accountability. He could have, with all the money he made, paid these women at least some type of compensation. He seemed like he was a smart businessman. He could have done a different business model. He could have turned the page on the things that he was doing at some point to try to do some good. But it seems that even to this day, he's still a miserable jerk who doesn't care about anyone but himself. He has been very harmful physically, emotionally, mentally to people, many people, even the mother of his children and probably all children. His own mother having to put a restraining order on him because he was assaulting his father and then eventually her, and then had the nerve to write her a letter and ask her if she was dead yet. Like, who does that? It sounds to me like this guy truly might have some mental issues. Seems to me he needs some hospitalization or maybe some medication. But if he isn't already living a personal hell, he definitely will be going to hell. And it's just a shame that the culture that he's taking credit for has led to a lot of things that we're learning about now, like with this Diddy case, the trafficking, the freak offs, people being drugged and filmed without their consent, so many people being assaulted and raped and tricked out of their rightful careers. There are a lot of people who were greatly talented, who were taken advantage of and were not able to fulfill their dreams. And a lot of the girls that Joe Francis took advantage of and I feel stole their lives, they probably had a lot of potential for their life and purpose as well. So hopefully this documentary will fulfill some of that purpose for some of them, the ones who participated in helping, to shape the young lives of someone who could be watching this, or somebody who could potentially be caught up with a Joe Francis of today or a Diddy of today and not be really aware of the dangers that they face. So I just say shout out to this reporter, Sachi Cole, who took 4 years of her life to interview this guy and deal with his antics and his abuses to get this raw story about things that most of us had no idea was going on behind the scenes of Girls Gone Wild. So shout out to her, and hopefully she gets, everything that she deserves out of her hard work, and everybody else who assisted her in getting this piece together and putting it out on Peacock. But it was a very, very eye-opening. I'm glad I watched it. I hope you were able to visualize some of the things that I didn't have pictures for. And let me know in the comments what you think about Joe Francis and the Girls Gone Wild franchise. Do you remember it at all? Was anybody affected by this? I feel like society as a whole would have been much better off today had there not been a Joe Francis and Girls Gone Wild franchise. But here we are, and all we can do is get better from here. So I think I'll leave it here. Thanks for listening. Till next time, bye.